Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, well, cut through that daily flood of global information, try and bring you the insights that really matter. In a world that's constantly shifting, just staying properly informed can feel like a real challenge. So, our mission, like always, is to navigate all that complexity and deliver a curated journey through the most impactful stuff directly to you.
And this deep dive really covers a lot of ground. We're looking at everything from, major geopolitical flashpoints and big economic shifts, all the way to some pretty groundbreaking tech advances and even, well, some surprising cultural trends that are making waves. The idea isn't just to lay out what's happening. We want to shed light on why it's important and maybe reveal some hidden links between things that seem, totally separate at first glance.
Okay, let's start our journey into these global shifts with what's been happening geopolitically. There's been a recent surge, particularly a really significant development in the Middle East. Just this June, the U.S. launched strikes targeting key Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan. And the scale, well, it was pretty big. We're talking 125 aircraft involved, and reports suggest they even used a decoy aircraft.
That's right. Iran, well, they quickly claimed the damage was minimal, but their leadership is definitely at a crossroads now. Do they retaliate and risk a much wider war, or do they go back to nuclear talks, probably facing tougher demands from the U.S.? And what's really telling is the immediate international reaction. You have the UN, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Oman, all condemning the U.S. strikes pretty quickly, even while Washington was apparently sending messages to Tehran urging them back to the table for peace talks.
Right, that immediate condemnation is significant. And these kinds of geopolitical tremors, they always hit the markets, don't they? What did we see initially on the economic front?
Oh, absolutely. Markets reacted just as you'd expect.
Yeah.
Investors started bracing for oil prices to jump, and there was a definite move towards safer assets like the U.S. dollar. People were anticipating a stock market dip, worried about inflation. But, it's interesting to look back historically. Often, equity pullbacks after Middle East tensions, think back to the 2003 Iraq invasion or the Saudi oil facility attacks in 2019, they tended to be pretty short-lived.
Short-lived. But does that pattern still hold? I mean, are things maybe more fragile this time around? Could we be underestimating the potential long-term impact?
That's the key question, isn't it? Are those past instances a reliable guide, or are the underlying economic conditions different now? It's something analysts are watching very closely.
Okay. And speaking of oil, let's pivot to the global oil market itself, because there's a dynamic here that might surprise some listeners. You'd probably assume, with all the talk about climate change, that oil consumption is going down. But actually, the world is burning through over 100 million barrels of oil every single day. And demand is growing, not shrinking. A lot of that growth is coming from Asia, especially with China's economy reopening more fully.
Exactly. And Russia, despite all the sanctions, is still managing to sell its oil. They're offering discounts, finding new buyers, Turkey, Singapore, China, and notably India. India's really ramped up its refining capacity to take advantage of that cheaper Russian crude. And it's crucial to remember this. State-owned companies control over three-quarters, more than 75% of the world's oil reserves. So when OPEC Plus decides to cut production, it's often as much about balancing their own national budgets as it is about global market supply and demand.
So we have this clear paradox then. Rising oil demand happening at the same time as global commitments like the Paris Agreement aiming to cut emissions. How do we make sense of that?
It really highlights just how deeply fossil fuels are still embedded in the global economy, particularly for developing countries. It shows the sheer difficulty, the friction involved in the energy transition. It's not something policy can just fix overnight. You see different forecasts on peak demand. Some, like BP, think it could happen before 2030. Others say it's much further off. And remember, oil isn't just for cars and planes. It's vital for petrochemicals, for fertilizers, for so many things. Look at developing nations, especially in Africa. Their energy needs, including oil, are actually set to grow as their economies develop. But then they often face restrictions from Western banks and institutions when it comes to funding new fossil fuel projects. It makes their transition pathway really, really complex.
That's a really important point about the complexities facing developing nations. Now, while oil is clearly a major factor, let's shift to another energy source that's key for decarbonization but has its own set of challenges: nuclear power.
Right, nuclear is zero-emission power, so it's definitely part of the conversation for hitting climate goals.
Yeah.
We're seeing new plants being built, notably in China and Saudi Arabia, which is a sharp contrast to, say, Germany, where opposition has been strong, even when they were facing an energy crisis. But then you look at France and Sweden, and they're actually moving to increase their nuclear capacity again. And Japan. Despite the public concerns after Fukushima, they've made the tough call to restart some plants because they need the energy security. But the big hurdles remain. Nuclear projects are notorious for cost overruns, and, well, let's face it, nuclear power still has a major PR problem globally.
Yeah, that PR problem is huge. You wonder what it would take to shift public perception, especially now when we urgently need clean energy sources. Okay, moving from the tangible world of energy infrastructure, let's talk about something less visible but maybe just as critical. Cybersecurity threats. This is a huge modern challenge.
It really is. And the threat landscape is incredibly diverse. It's not just about, massive state attacks trying to take down power grids, although that's a concern. It's also attacks on private companies trying to steal data, disrupt operations, or just undermine the basic integrity of our digital world. The economic costs are just staggering. Think about the WannaCry ransomware. The cost estimates are over $1 billion. NotPetya cost the shipping giant Maersk something like $300 million in lost revenue. And Lloyd's of London put out a stark report predicting a major cyber attack on just one cloud provider could trigger $53 billion in economic losses. That's comparable to a major hurricane like Sandy. What's really crucial here, the deep dive insight perhaps, is how cyber conflict blurs the lines and mixes economic competition with national security. Every company is potentially on the front line, and trust in our digital systems becomes a real casualty. Russia's FSB estimates the annual cost already hit $300 billion globally. Juniper Research thinks it could reach $8 trillion over the next 5 years.
8 trillion? The scale is just mind-blowing. How can we possibly start to get a handle on something so pervasive? International cooperation seems like it must be part of the answer.
Absolutely essential. There are several key recommendations floating around. One is restarting the U.S.-Russia dialogue, specifically on cyber issues. People point to the U.S.-China agreement back in 2015 on cyber economic espionage, which did seem to reduce state-sponsored hacking for a while. So precedent exists. There's also a push to get UN experts back together and actually implement the norms they agreed on in 2015, things like states preventing their territory from being used for cyber attacks, not targeting critical infrastructure. And here's a really important one. States should be required to report cyber vulnerabilities they find to the companies affected, instead of hoarding them for potential offensive use. The WannaCry incident is the prime example. The vulnerability was allegedly known by the NSA but not disclosed widely enough, fast enough. Longer term, some are even talking about setting up an international cyber court within 5 years and actually codifying cyber attack laws into international law within a decade.
Really ambitious goals there. Now, shifting from the digital battlefield back to the physical one, technology is obviously changing how wars are fought, too. We saw that recently with the performance of Israel's F-35 variant, the Adir, during those strikes in Iran. Reports say these jets carried out dozens of long-range strikes against heavily defended targets, air defenses, missile sites, even nuclear facilities, flew deep into Iran, apparently met little resistance, and crucially, suffered no losses.
Yeah, that performance really pushes back against the narrative that manned fighter jets are becoming obsolete. But at the very same time, you see the U.S. military pouring investment into small offensive drones through this replicator program. They want to field thousands of them, air and sea. And this isn't just about tactics, it's a fundamental strategic shift. Drones are cheap, potentially numerous, and they challenge the whole doctrine built around expensive high-tech platforms. It forces militaries to grapple with attrition warfare fought at a much lower cost point, potentially changing the whole balance of power. It creates this really difficult strategic problem. How do you justify using multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot down drones that might cost only thousands or even hundreds of dollars, especially if they come in swarms?
That cost asymmetry is fascinating. And these shifts in military tech, well, they're happening alongside broader changes in the global economy, impacting everything from trade to jobs. Let's widen the lens now to that overall global economic picture.
Okay, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, they're forecasting global growth to slow down to about 2.3% in 2025. Now, that's below the 2.5% mark that economists often see as flirting with a global recessionary phase. And a worrying trend they highlighted is capital flowing towards perceived safer assets in advanced economies. That tends to put developing countries at a disadvantage. although one bright spot seems to be South trade between developing countries themselves. That's actually expanding faster than other trade flows, especially in East and Southeast Asia.
Interesting. And amidst that slowdown, we're still seeing specific trade frictions, right? Like China exporting a lot of cheap EVs to Brazil and U.S. ports becoming these focal points in ongoing trade disputes. Tariffs are affecting various sectors, putting strain on international agreements. It really paints a picture of a somewhat fragmented global economy.
Definitely fragmented. And another huge economic current is how technology, particularly AI, is impacting jobs.
Right. We heard Amazon's CEO, Andy Jassy, saying AI will cut jobs in some areas but actually create jobs in others. But then you see reports that Microsoft is planning potentially thousands of layoffs, mainly in sales, even as they're investing billions in AI.
It points towards a significant restructuring. And then there's that really interesting development with NVIDIA and Foxconn. They're planning to use humanoid robots in a new factory in Houston to build AI servers. That's a first for NVIDIA products and for Foxconn's AI server plants, robots building the hardware for AI.
Wow, humanoid robots on the factory floor. That feels like a glimpse into the future.
It really does.
Yeah.
It speaks to this ongoing automation drive, seeking efficiency, demanding new skills from the workforce. And if you want an example of economic stagnation hitting closer to home, look at the U.S. housing market. It's just sluggish.
Yeah.
Contract activity is down. Buyers and sellers are kind of in a standoff. Prices haven't really dropped much, even with more houses on the market, but buyers are being really selective. And nobody expects those super low interest rates to come back anytime soon. It shows how these big economic trends impact everyday household decisions.
Okay, so we've covered geopolitics, energy, cyber, the economy. But it's crucial to connect all this back to, well, human progress overall. How are we doing on those big global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs? The UN just had a forum reviewing them.
Yes, the high-level political forum, the HLPF, and the assessment was pretty stark, honestly. We're only 5 years away from the 2030 deadline for the SDGs, but only about 17%, 1/7 of the targets are actually on track. A huge issue is funding a massive financing gap. For example, the U.S. suspended a huge chunk, 83% of USAID programs back in March 2025. That halted something like $60 billion in funding for UN agencies. That impacts everything: food aid, healthcare programs, emergency response, efforts against gender-based violence. And it's not just the U.S. Some EU members are also cutting back on their aid commitments. The forum also did deep dives into specific goals: health, SDG 3, gender equality, SDG 5, decent work, SDG 8, oceans, SDG 14, and partnerships, SDG 17.
Let's focus on SDG 5, gender equality. What was the takeaway there?
It's a mixed picture. There's been some moderate progress within the EU itself, but globally, there are real concerns about increasing restrictions on sexual and reproductive rights in many places. And the data on violence against women remains horrifying. In the EU, roughly 1 in 3 women have experienced physical or sexual violence. 1 in 6, sexual violence specifically. 1 in 5, domestic violence. Globally, the statistic is that a woman or girl is killed, often by a partner or family member, every 10 minutes. Now, the EU did bring in new legislation in 2024 to combat violence against women, which is progress. But there are still gaps. For instance, they couldn't agree on an EU-wide definition of rape based on lack of consent. So, still work to do.
That statistic every 10 minutes is just devastating. And what about SDG 8, decent work and economic growth? How's that looking?
Globally, SDG 8 is way off track. We're actually seeing an increase in child labor and forced labor. Around 28 million people worldwide are still trapped in forced labor situations. The EU brought in a forced labor regulation in 2024 to try and tackle this, basically banning products made with forced labor from the EU market. But it's complex. It's also interesting to note that raw material consumption within the EU has actually gone up. That connects directly back to labor standards and global supply chains, showing how our consumption patterns are linked to these issues.
Okay, now for something completely different, but equally fascinating in its own way. It gives us a glimpse into consumer culture and, well, market frenzy. Mart. This company's selling collectible blind box toys. Their international growth has been huge, revenues are soaring, and some of the rare dolls, they're reselling for incredible amounts, up to $150,000 in some cases.
It's wild, isn't it? People are calling Labubu, one of their characters, Gen Z's Beanie Baby 2.0. It seems to tap into this potent mix of nostalgia, collectability, and that kawaii, the Japanese concept of cuteness aesthetic. It's a really interesting case study in how cultural products can suddenly become these massive economic phenomena. Though it's worth mentioning, even with all this success, Mart has faced regulatory scrutiny back in China, which actually caused its stock price to dip for a while. So even something seemingly lighthearted like collectible toys isn't immune to bigger geopolitical or policy shifts. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Could even playthings become sort of strategic assets in the future?
That's a really provocative thought. Okay, from tiny toys commanding huge prices, let's make one final dramatic pivot to a truly staggering scientific achievement. NASA's Parker Solar Probe. It has now touched the sun for the third and final time.
Yeah, this is just awe-inspiring stuff. The probe flew within just 3.86 million miles of the sun's surface. NASA calls it hyper close. And its speed is almost impossible to comprehend, 430,000 miles per hour. Think about that fast enough to get from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. in literally 1 second.
Incredible speed, and the heat it endures.
Exactly. Temperatures hitting somewhere between 1,600 and 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, and is protected only by this relatively thin carbon composite heat shield. The whole point of the mission, its main goal, is to figure out this long-standing mystery. Why is the sun's outer atmosphere, the corona, millions of degrees hotter than its actual surface, the photosphere? This probe is finally giving us the data to potentially answer that.
So we've really covered a lot today. From those intense geopolitical situations in the Middle East, the strange paradoxes in oil demand, these invisible cyber threats, to the shifts in the global economy, challenges in human progress, surprising cultural crazes like Pop Mart, and even a spacecraft flying right up to the sun. It really underscores how these aren't just separate news items. They're all connected pieces of this larger, incredibly complex global puzzle.
Precisely. And connecting those dots, seeing how, say, energy policy impacts geopolitics, which impacts markets, which impacts funding for development goals, that's the key. Understanding these interconnections, the ripple effects, is really crucial if you want to make sense of the world we're living in.
Which brings us perfectly to our final thought for you, the listener, to take away and chew on. In a world where, as we've discussed, collectible toys can fetch six figures and state-owned companies dominate global energy, what unexpected human-driven factor, something beyond the obvious tech or geopolitics, do you think will emerge as the most powerful force shaping our collective future in the next year or so? What really stands out to you?